The Duel, without a victor, the F-5 Tiger II and the MiG-21, and the limits of Cold War air power in Iraq War. Introduction: A rivalry forged by the Cold War. Few military debates have endured as stubbornly as the question whether the American-built North Northrop F-5E Tiger II or the Soviet-designed MiG-21 Bison was the superior fighter aircraft. Produced in extraordinary numbers exported across ideological boundaries, these two lightweight jets became symbols of their respective Cold War blocs. They were not designed as luxury instruments of air superiority, but as practical tools, cheap, fast, simple, and lethal when flown correctly. For decades, the popular narrative claimed that the F-5 and the MiG-21 never truly faced one another in combat. This assumption allowed endless speculation, abstract comparisons, and technical debates detached from the realities of war. Yet history contradicts this myth. The two aircrafts did meet, first in Africa, later more decisively in the skies over Iran and Iraq, during one of the 20th century's most brutal and under-examined conflicts. The Iran-Iraq War, lasting from 1980s to 1988, provided a rare and revealing laboratory two opposing air forces equipped with different ideological machines, trained under different doctrines, forced into direct confrontation under extreme political, economic, and technological pressure. What emerged from this context contest was not a clear winner, but a deeper truth about air combat in the late Cold War era. Cold War origins, two philosophies of power. The F-5 and the MiG-21 were born from opposite strategic cultures. The United States designed the F-5 as a lightweight, export-friendly fighter that Allied nations could operate without the logistical burden of high-end American aircraft. It emphasized agility, simplicity, ease of maintenance. Northrop engineers believed that a smaller, well-balanced aircraft, if flown by a trained pilot, could survive and succeed against more sophisticated opponents. The Soviet Union, by contrast, produced the MiG-21 as a mass solution to mass warfare. The Fishbed was fast, capable of extreme climb rates, and designed to be built and operated in enormous numbers. Soviet doctrine assumed short, violent conflicts where speed, interception, and numerical saturation mattered more than pilot comfort or electronic sophistication. The MiG-21 wasn't elegant, it was efficient. Together, this aircraft became widely used supersonic fighters in history. More than 15,000 were built, over 60 air forces flew them. In some countries, both aircraft served side by side, further blurring ideological boundaries in practice, not in propaganda. Iran on the brink, revolution and collapse. The context of their confrontation matters as much as the aircraft themselves. In 1979, Iran underwent the Iranian Revolution, a political uphill that did more than topple a monarchy. It shattered a military institution. The Imperial Iranian Air Force, once one of the most sophisticated in the region, was decimated by purges, arrests, execution, and forced retirements. Experienced pilots vanished, maintenance crews disappeared, supply chains collapsed. When Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, Iran's Air Force, now reorganized as the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, was operating under extreme conditions. Yet it possessed a core of skilled pilots trained in the United States and a fleet of F-5 Tiger IIs that, while not cutting edge, remained capable in close combat. Iraq, meanwhile, entered the war with confidence. Its air force was intact, numerically strong, heavily equipped with Soviet aircraft. The MiG-21 Bisons formed the backbone of the Iraqi fighter operations, supplemented by newer types and a glowing missile inventory. On paper, Iraq had the advantage. The first encounter, skill over shock. The first recorded clashes between Iranian F-5s and Iraqi MiG-21s occurred within days of the invasion. These early encounters shattered assumptions on both sides. Iraqi pilots expected a broken, disorganized enemy. Instead, they encountered disciplined formations, aggressive maneuvering, and pilots willing to fight at close range. In one of the earliest engagements, an Iraqi missile detonated beneath an Iranian F-5 without destroying it. The Iranian pilot responded instantly, turning towards the threat and firing a sidewinder that destroyed a MiG-21. The lesson was immediate and brutal. Technological parity meant nothing without situational awareness and pilot resolve. At the, as the war escalated, Iran launched systematic strikes against Iraqi oil infrastructure. These missions were forced repeated interceptions. These missions forced repeated interceptions, creating the condition for multiple F-5 versus MiG-21 encounters. The skies over northern Iraq became arenas of constant tension where engagement unfolded at low altitude, often within visual range, under the shadow of ground-based air defenses. The November battle, a test of limits. The most significant confrontation occurred in November 1980 during a complex Iranian strike involving multiple targets deep inside Iraqi territory. Iraqi MiG-21 patrols intercepted the attacking formations, leading to a series of engagements that illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of each aircraft. Missiles failed to track, pilot misidentified targets, combat degenerated into low-speed, low-altitude maneuvering where cannons replaced radar-guided weapons. In one encounter, an Iranian pilot forced a MiG-21 into a fatal mistake by dragging it down towards the terrain. In another, aircraft collided, killing both pilots. These battles produced no decisive advantage. Instead, they were revealed a deeper reality. Both aircraft were operating at the edge of their technological relevance. Designed in 1950s, they were now flying into environments saturated with radar, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery. Survival increasingly depended not on air-to-air superiority but on avoiding detection altogether. Technology retreat, the rise of the ground threat. By the late 1980s, it became clear that the F-5s and MiG-21s were no longer masters of the battlefield. Neither aircraft possessed advantage and advanced electronic countermeasures, radar warning receivers, or beyond visual range weapons. Their pilots faced threats not just from each other but from invisible systems on the ground. Surface-to-air missile, radar-controlled flak, claimed more aircraft than dogfights ever did. The airspace itself had become lethal. Both Iran and Iraq began relegating their lightweight fighters to secondary roles, using them for ground attacks, patrol, limited interception, while relying on newer aircraft for high-risk missions. The last known F-5 versus MiG-21 engagement occurred in 1983. By then, the era of their rivalry was effectively over. The final accounting, a perfect stalemate. As far as the verified records indicate, the Iran-Iraq war ended with an exact balance for this duel. 4 F-5s destroyed, 4 MiG-21s lost in air-to-air combat. No ace emerged, no aircraft provided categorically superior. Claims and counterclaims cancelled each other out. This outcome frustrates those who seek winners. It offers something more valuable, a lesson. The human constant. Iran-Iraq war demonstrates that by the late Cold War, fighter aircraft alone no longer determined control of the sky. Technology had shifted the balance towards integrated air defense systems, electronic warfare and network sensors. In such an environment, lightweight fighters designed for previous generation of warfare could survive only through pilot skill, discipline and restraint. The F-5 Tiger II and the MiG-21 Fishbed were not failures. They were performed exactly as they were designed to perform, within limits imposed by history. Their confrontation didn't produce a victor because conditions no longer allowed one. In the end, the duel was not between machines, but between men trained differently, flying differently yet bound by the same physics, fear, and fragility. The skies ran over Iran and Iraq didn't crown a champion, they delivered a verdict far more than sobering. Technology evolves, doctrine shifts, but the war remains unforgiving and indifferent to legends. The rivalry between the F-5 Tiger and the MiG-21 Fishbed didn't begin in the skies of Iran and Iraq. It began decades earlier on maps in ideology and in fear. To understand why these two aircrafts were built and why they spread across the world in such vast numbers, one must first understand the Cold War system that demanded them. After the Second World War, the global power fractured into two inconcilable blocs. The United States. On one side stood the United States and its allies, bound together through institutions such as NATO. On the other stood the Soviet Union and its satellite states, organized military under the Warsaw Pact. This was not merely a military division, it was an existential one. Each side believed that the other represented not just a rival but a threat to its way of life. Maps from the era tell us this story visually. The world was colored in blue and red, influence zones stretching across continents. Europe was split down the middle. Asia became a patchwork of proxy states. Africa and the Middle East turned into contested arenas where ideology, resources, and geography intersected. This was a global confrontation without a single continuous battlefield. What mattered was reach, presence, and deterrence. Air power became central to this struggle. Aircraft could cross borders in minutes. They could strike deep into enemy territory. They could deliver nuclear weapons. As a result, the fighter jet became one of the most politically charged machines ever created. It was not only a weapon, it was a symbol of technological competence, industrial capacity, and ideological superiority. In the United States, the reality was reflected in Cold War propaganda and recruitment material. Posters emphasized freedom, technological brilliance, and the idea of defending the free world from communist expansion. Pilots were depicted as guardians of democracy, flying advanced machines that represented America's ingenuity and precision. Yet, beneath this imaginary beneath this imaginary lay a strategic calculation. The US needed not only elite aircraft for its own forces but reliable fighters it could export to allies across the globe. The Soviet Union approached this problem differently. Soviet aviation propaganda emphasized collective strength, discipline, inevitability. Aircrafts were portrayed as tools of the people's state, efficient, rugged, and uncompromising. The goal wasn't elegance, but dominance through numbers and resilience. If war came, it would be short, violent, and undecided by precision rather by mass and speed. This divergence shaped aircraft design philosophy. The United States invested heavily in cutting edge platforms for itself, but it also required a simpler fighter jet that allies could afford, operate, and maintain. The Soviet Union needed a fighter that could be produced rapidly, dispersed widely, and flown from austere bases, even if pilot survival or comfort was secondary. However, over all of this was the nuclear shadow. Missile silos buried deep underground, DEFCON alert levels, and constant readiness drills reinforced the belief that the next war might be the last. In such an environment, air forces were expected to respond instantly. Fighters had to scramble in interception, climb at extreme rates. The skies were no longer just airspace, they were front line of civilization itself. By the 1960s, the world had resembled a geopolitical pressure cooker. Lines of tension ran through Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond. Each regional conflict risked escalation. Every aircraft sale carried ideological weight. A fighter jet delivered to an allied nation was not just hardware, it was alignment. It was within the environment that aircraft like the F-5 and the MiG-21 emerged as strategic necessities. They were answers to a world divided, militarized, and perpetually prepared for catastrophes. Their later confrontation in regional wars was not accidental, it was inevitable consequences of a global system that exported rivalry along with weapons. Before they ever faced each other in combat, the F-5 and MiG-21 were already enemies, born on opposite sides of a world split in two. The American contribution to the F-5 versus MiG-21 rivalry didn't emerge from a desire to dominate the skies outright. It emerged from a more restrained, calculated vision of global power, one shaped by alliances, logistics, and political reality. The Northrop 5 F-5E Tiger II was never meant to be the crown jewel of American air power. Instead, it was designed to be something arguably more influential, a dependable fighter for allies operating on the front lines of the Cold War. In the 1950s and 60s, American aircraft manufacturing had reached an extraordinary level of sophistication. Inside Northrop factories, assembly lines reflected industrial confidence. Orderly rows of airplanes, engineers moved methodically between stations, tolerances measured with almost obsessive care. The F-5 construction reflected this culture. It was compact, cleanly engineered, and intentionally conservative. intentionally conservative. Each component served a purpose, and nothing existed for spectacle alone. Engineers inspected the F-5 airframe were not chasing radical innovation, they were refining balance. The aircraft's small radar cross-section, straightforward avionics, and twin-engine reliability were deliberate choices. Northrop understood that many of the nations receiving the F-5 would lack extensive maintenance infrastructure. The jet had to be forgiving, easy to service, resilient under hard conditions, from desert heat to austere runways. The roll-out ceremonies of early F-5 reflected quiet confidence rather than triumphalism. Pardon. There was no theatrical unveiling, no grandiose rhetoric. This was a machine meant to work, not to impress. Its elegance lay in proportion, simple fuselage, swept wings, and aerodynamic cleanliness that made the aircraft visually deceptive. It looked smaller than it was, faster than it appeared, and simpler than it truly was. Taxiing shots of early F-5s on pristine runways captured this philosophy perfectly. The aircraft sat low and poised, ready rather than aggressive. It contrasts to heavier American fighters. The F-5 conveyed restraint. It was not built to intimidate adversaries through sheer size or complexity. It was built to give pilots confidence that the aircraft would respond exactly as expected. That confidence became most visible when the F-5 climbed with afterburners lit. The Tiger II could punch through crowd layers with surprising authority. Though not the fastest or the highest flying aircraft of its era, it possessed a harmony of thrust, weight, and control that made it exceptionally predictable in combat aviation. Predictability is not weakness, it is survival. Inside the cockpit, this design ethos continued. A5 canopy offered excellent visibility, a crucial advantage in close-range engagements. Instrumentation was clear, intuitive, and uncluttered. Pilots transitioned from trainers to older aircraft found the F5 accessible, almost welcoming. This was not accidental. The aircraft was designed to shorten the learning curve for Allied pilots, many of whom were transitioning rapidly due to geopolitical urgency. Weaponry on the F-5 illustrated American pragmatism. The aircraft carried AIM-9 Sidewinder, a heat-seeking missile that emphasized reliability over complexity. It didn't require advanced radar integration or expensive pilot workload. In addition, the F-5 retained internal 20 cannons, an acknowledgement that missile combat was not always decisive and that close-range engagements still mattered. The gun ports on the F-5 were not decorative relics, they were functional necessities. American designers recognized that in real combat, especially over hostile territory, pilots might find themselves inside visual range, low on fuel, operating under degraded conditions. In such moments, can remain brutally effective. Perhaps the most telling testament to the F-5's design philosophy was its service in Iran. Before the revolution, Iran was one of America's most significantly strategic allies in the Middle East. Iranian F-5s marked the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force insignia after 1979. Continued flying long after American support vanished. Despite sanctions, shortages, and political isolations, Iranian technicians kept the aircraft operational, often cannibalizing parts, improvising repairs, extending the airframe life far beyond original expectations. Emotionally, the F-5 represented American confidence without access. It was elegant without being fragile, precise without being elitist, and powerful without being domineering. As an export fighter, it embodied a quiet assertion of trust that allies could fight effectively without the most advanced technology, trust that skill and discipline could compensate for limitations, and trust that simplicity could outlast complexity. In the skies of Iran-Iraq war, the philosophy would be tested against a very difficult vision of air power. The F-5 entered that context not as a symbol of American dominance but as a proof of American restraint, a machine built to empower others even when the world around them collapsed. Now let's talk about the MiG-21 Bisons. Early MiG-21 Bison prototype photographs reveal the mindset clearly. The aircraft's narrow fuselage, sharp pointed nose intake, the delta wings were optimized for supersonic fighter and rapid interception. There was little margin of error in the design. The MiG-21 demanded discipline and precision from the pilots, offering little forgiveness in return. It was not a machine that invited confidence, it enforced it. If the American F-5s represented restraint and trust in American competence, the Soviet MiG-21 Bisons represent something far colder and more uncompromising. The MiG-21 wasn't designed to be elegant or unforgiving or reassuring. It was designed to be fast, lethal, expendable if necessary. In the strategic imagination of the Soviet Union, air power was not about individual brilliance. It was about overwhelming force applied at decisive moments. The origins of this philosophy can be traced back to the halls of the Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau. Within these design offices, blueprints were not works of art, but instruments of doctrine. Soviet engineers at drafting tables worked under strict performance requirements: maximum speed, rapid climb rate, minimal production complexity, and the ability to operate from rough, dispersed airfields. Comfort, visibility, long-term pilot survivability ranked lower than the aircraft's ability to reach an enemy bomber quickly and destroy it. Early MiG-21 prototype photographs reveal this mindset clearly. Nothing symbolizes the Fishbed's character more vividly than its vertical climb. With afterburner engaged, the MiG-21 could skyrocket, nose pointed almost directly at the heavens. This was not a mere This was not merely a performance feature, it was a doctrinal statement. The MiG-21 was built to intercept, to rise quickly into hostile airspace, and to strike before the enemy could react. Speed was survival, altitude was advantage. Close-up views of the MiG-21 afterburner capture this philosophy in mechanical form. The exhaust plume was violent, concentrated, and unapologetic. Fuel was consumed rapidly, range was sacrificed, and endurance was limited. And none of that mattered if the mission was completed within minutes. In Soviet planning, they were expected to be short, decisive, and catastrophic. The MiG-21 was built for the opening moments of such a conflict. The Red Star insignia painted on MiG-21 fuselage reinforced its identity. It was not merely a national marking, it was a declaration of ideological presence. Whenever the MiG-21 flew, it carried the authority of the Soviet state. Exporting the aircraft was not just a commercial act, it was a strategic one. Each MiG-21 delivered to a client state extended Soviet influence and doctrine into new regions. Weaponry further reflected this worldview. The MiG-21 was armed with AA-2 Atoll missile, the Soviet adaptation of heat-seeking technology, later with more capable AA-8 Aphid. These missiles prioritized simplicity and speed over sophistication. They were meant to be launched quickly, often under ground control guidance with minimal pilot decision making. The Fishbed wasn't designed to give pilots choices, it was designed to execute commands. This approach made the MiG-21 highly effective in the hands of a well-organized air defense system. Ground controllers vectored pilots towards targets, reducing the need for complex onboard sensors. In theory, the MiG-21 was one component in a larger machine, a cog in a vast centralized approach of radar, missiles, and command structures. When exported to the Middle East, however, the Fishbed was forced to operate under heavy different conditions. In desert camouflage, flying over Iran and Iraq, MiG-21s often lacked the dense ground control networks envisioned by Soviet planners. Pilots were required to make independent decisions, engage in close-range maneuvering, and adapt to unpredictable environments. In such circumstances, the aircraft's limitation became more apparent. The MiG-21 was unforgiving at low speeds. Its delta wing bled energy rapidly in sustained turns. Its cockpit visibility was limited. Fuel reserves were tight, yet it remained dangerous, especially in the opening moments of an engagement. If a MiG-21 entered a fight with altitude and speed, it could strike decisively, disengage before the enemy could respond. Emotionally, the MiG-21 conveyed menace rather than reassurance. It looked fast because it was fast. It looked sharp because it was sharp. There was no softness in its design, no concession to comfort. It was a weapon shaped by a state that expected sacrifice, demanded obedience, and valued results above anything else. The Iran-Iraq war, the philosophy collided with a very different tone. The MiG-21 entered the conflict as a predator built for speed and aggression, but it found itself facing not only enemy aircraft, but terrain missiles and pilots who refused to behave as doctrine predicted. The Fishbed was still lethal, but no longer dominant. The Soviet version that produced the MiG-21 was not wrong, it was simply bounded by assumptions that how wars would be fought in the future. In the skies over the Middle East, those assumptions would be tested, stretched, and ultimately it got exposed.